Hello and good afternoon to everyone here in the room and our audience online. We apologize for the delay, which is due to the technical challenge of establishing a simultaneous speaking and broadcasting situation, but I think we have managed to achieve the model that we had in mind. My name is Vincent Hediger. I'm a principal investigator at ConTrust, the research center which studies the dynamics of trust and conflict in complex modern societies here at Goethe University Frankfurt. I'm also a co-director of ConTrust, and it is my distinct honor to welcome today's speaker in our ConTrust speaker series, Professor Pooja Rangan, who is an associate professor of English and the chair of film and media studies at Amherst College. Documentary is obviously a form that is important to study in relation to questions of trust and conflict. Social documentary in particular is one of the most effective form of communicating about social conflict and most effective form for generating trust and instigating social action. Pooja Rangan is one of the leading scholars in the field, and her work is particularly important to the reflection that we're conducting here at ConTrust, because in her book Mediations, which was published in 2017 and won the Best First Book Prize of the American Association of Comparative Literature in 2019, she studies the humanitarian assumptions in participatory documentary in various fields and formats, and she does so with a particularly critical eye and approach, teasing out and analyzing certain of the othering assumptions built into the humanitarian approach to participatory documentary. And this is a challenge that she has brought to the field of documentary studies that has been particularly fruitful for our own reflection on documentary here at ConTrust. And we were particularly happy that Pooja Rangan accepted our invitation to join ConTrust as a research fellow this summer on relatively short notice, I might also say, so we're particularly lucky. And Pooja has agreed to share with us an excerpt from her ongoing research under the title of Listening in Crip Time Towards New Forms of Documentary Trust. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vincent. So I just want to start by thanking everyone at ConTrust, especially sweet Christopher, who had to go through all kinds of permutations to get us set up over here. But thank you for your warm welcome. I have to also thank in absentia our colleague Lalib Melamed for conspiring to bring me here. And Vincent, thanks so much for inviting me to share my research as a fellow here. So I hope that I can contribute some useful concepts and approaches to your ongoing discussions about trust and conflict. I'll begin with a brief visual description for anyone who might need it. I'm an Indian woman with short salt and pepper hair. I'm wearing a white boxy top, black pants, and blue pointy shoes. So while I'm speaking, I'm going to show some slides with text, image, and film clips. All are subtitled or captioned. And in cases where the description of or the content of what I'm showing isn't clear, I'll be describing the contents. So my talk is composed of 3 parts and a conclusion. So I'll move through these in turn. And for those of you joining on Zoom, I will just at various points be showing some brief video clips. So at those moments, I'll just ask you to get out of the Zoom, mute the Zoom, and go and watch the video clips yourselves if you're joining online on Zoom. And you'll find the links in the chat along with the time codes. Part 1, the ableism of the documentary audit. Jordan Lord's film Shared Resources begins where verite films in the Russian mold sometimes end. Lord's mother, father, and sister are shown reacting to an early cut of the film. I didn't just dislike it, I loathed it, hated it, despised it, says Albert, Lord's father, objecting to a pivotal scene in which he appears visibly and audibly disoriented after a hospital visit. We learn later that Albert lives with life-threatening chronic illnesses caused by Agent Orange exposure during the Vietnam War, including retinal damage that could culminate in blindness. We also learn that Albert has been debilitated by the stresses of working as a debt collector, losing the family's home to Hurricane Katrina, and subsequently losing his job and his VA disability benefits after filing for Chapter 13 bankruptcy, which is a 5-year debt repayment plan that permits repossession of the debtor's assets. The scene to which Albert objects immediately precedes the reaction scene. It is the first in the film. Crimson light fills the screen while Jordan, their mother, and their sister coax Albert to drink a glass of milk. Lord describes the images and text that appear on screen in an even-toned voice from off-screen. Lord interprets Albert's objection to his portrayal as weak and vulnerable as a statement of Albert's access needs, accommodations and adjustments that Albert will require in order to participate fully in the world of the film and the world in which it will circulate. And Lord responds to these needs by occluding Albert's image with their finger over the lens. In verbally describing that occlusion, an image that looks to me like objects passing before my closed eyelids on a sunny day, Lord anticipates Albert's future access needs were he to lose his vision, as well as those of blind and deaf viewers who might share the social experience of disability. For sighted and hearing audiences unaccustomed to watching a film with burned-in access features like open captions, by which I mean non-optional captions, and a verbal description of what is shown, what is commonly called audio description, Lord's anticipatory accommodating vision can be disorienting. In the chapter of my forthcoming book from which this talk is drawn, I describe that disorientation as an awakening to the ableism of documentaries Audit. An awakening, that is, to the able-bodied assumptions, values, and practices that are housed and voiced by conventions of documentary sound that are so common that we barely notice them. The cropped framing known as the talking head, for example, or commentary spoken over images and other sounds, or the dictum that text and spoken commentary should be kept to a minimum so as not to spoil the image. We might call these conventions a type of unspoken contract. My talk, drawn from my book in progress on documentary listening, offers a counter history of listening and a counter theory of building trust by building access that centers the out-of-sync and misfitting temporal experiences that disability scholars have called Crip time. Ellen Samuels uses this term to describe how disability, debilitation, and illness can extract us from linear progressive time with its normative life stages and cast us into a wormhole of backward and forward acceleration, jerky stops and starts, tedious intervals, and abrupt endings. But Crip time also refers to the social capacities that can be cultivated, in Alison Kafer's words, by bending the clock to meet disabled bodies and minds, away from the capitalist values of productivity, self-sufficiency, independence, and achievement. Documentary filmmaking today is oriented around these values. A capital-intensive endeavor, documentary is framed, as Brett Story writes in a recent article, by, quote, fiercely competitive market structures for funding, platforms, exposure, and distribution that pit filmmakers against each other in a zero-sum fight for resources, end quote. No wonder then that in industry discourse, access is understood in transactional and extractive terms as the leveraging of money, force, reputation, or trust to broker entry to private or inaccessible realms deemed to harbor documentary value. In that same article, Story offers a provocation. She argues that documentary artists working today need a collectivized structure for sharing resources and risk that make the field as a whole more accessible by giving people the space, time, and security that they need to learn skills, to try out ideas, to develop relationships that serve their social needs and the common good, rather than predatory market demands. The story describes this vision for a collectivized structure for sharing resources and risk in documentary as a new form of documentary trust. And she imagines this along the lines of community land trusts that remove land from real estate speculation and hold it in a trust for community use. So I want to talk today about how disability activism allows us to think about the transformative shifts in social relations, in values, in commitments that can ensue from approaching access as a matter of trust, understood as a collective resource and a shared responsibility. And I'm interested in how documentarians like Lord can catalyze these shifts by bending their audit, and by using that word audit, A-U-D-I-T, I'm referring to a kind of auditory equivalent of the gaze, something that subtends the field of listening. By bending their audit to disability as a political experience, by listening in Crip time. My talk places Lord's shared resources in conversation with Hara Kazuo's controversial film, Goodbye CP, cerebral palsy is what CP stands for, made in 1972 with the participation of Hara's disabled partner and producer Kobayashi Sachiko and members of the Kanagawa Green Grasses, a self-organized advocacy group of people with cerebral palsy, CP, who were key players in the disability rights and independent living movements in Japan. My tangent consideration of these two seemingly minor contributions to the Crip film canon asserts their significance in centering disability expertise in documentary conversations about access, which is also a crucial but poorly understood aspect of listening. Hara has been both lionized and reproached as a pioneer of this kind of access theft, a kind of coerced access that entered documentary practice with the mid-century verite turn. He became infamous for honing an almost principled disregard for his collaborators, his audiences, and even his own private life into a style in its own right, which he called action documentary. And Michael Moore and Errol Morris both name Hara as a major influence, so this gives you a sense of the style, which you also see. In Goodbye CP, Hara goaded his disabled collaborators, Yokota Hiroshi and Yokotsuka Koichi, into reckless access performances by encouraging them, as pictured here, to throw away their wheelchairs and take to the streets. But few have considered how people with CP provoked Hara in turn to develop a form that would force audiences to reckon with the discomfort of delayed and denied access to social participation. By rejecting the accepted logic of subtitling the voices of people with disability-affected speech, Goodbye CP aggressively confronts or crips the expectations of non-disabled documentary listeners as an entitled and coercive form of auditory access, analogous with staring. The film's mismatched dissonance forces normate audiences to accommodate to the physical discomfort and risk that comes from listening in the provisional and delayed presence of linguistic access, or what I call disentitled listening in the mode of crawling rather than staring. I want to position the disability activism propelling Hara's adversarial redistribution of access as a precursor of Lord's more generous embrace of access as a transformative attack on documentary forms and values and shared resources. A meditation on their white Southern fathers' self-reliant attitude toward war debilitation and debt, the film reframes disability as the basis of the cinematic and social contract. A number of Crip-identified US and EU-based film and video artists have staged critiques of the low institutional bar for meeting legal accessibility standards in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed nearly 30 years ago in 1990 and has become a kind of template for rights-based anti-discrimination laws in other countries as well. Lord directs this critique at documentary form using open captions and burned-in audio description as the building blocks of a new documentary language. By rethinking access as a queer and Crip practice of sharing resources, Lord rewires a long systematic tradition of austerity thinking that has framed linguistic and sensory access features as burdensome additions that distract or subtract from aesthetic experience. The film invites a sideways listening, an attention to and an appetite for access understood not as a resentful obligation undertaken to avoid legal sanction, but as a collective practice of care that swells documentary meanings and horizons. Sounding out the tonal differences of these films against each other also amplifies the constructive tension between confrontation and care that disability scholars have attributed to Crip as a noun, verb, and practice for contesting ableist norms, while also inviting people into disability community. Cripping the conventional documentary vocabulary of access, which belongs in the realm of contracts, compliance, audits, liability and risk management, and here I'm using audit in the sense of financial verification. Cripping that notion of access reveals a more capacious understanding of access as the anticipatory and improvised work of building the supports for social inclusion across conflicting needs and across asymmetries of power. This is a kind of access that is less about logistics than about relationships, and it removes documentary relationships from propertied logics and holds them in trust. Goodbye CP and shared resources both refuse the conventional shortcuts, what I've previously called immediations, that would allow them to circulate more smoothly in an ableist and humanist marketplace. Their ambitious commitments to slowing down access and dilating time stand in inverse relation to their marginality. These films have no commercial distribution, they're not easily accessible online, and as such, they are invisible to the average viewer. This is why I respond to their invitation to listen in Crip time by producing a slow and careful archive of their listening notes. Part 2, Disentitled Access and Crawling Listening. These scenes scaffold Goodbye CP's access interventions. Both are set in trains and both feature Yokota, a poet and emerging leader in the Green Grasses movement. In the first hair-raising scene, Yokota, who has boarded a train without his wheelchair upon Hara's instigation, disembarks the train without assistance. Yokota first appears at the end of a low-angle tracking shot. Hara, holding the microphone and camera, has walked toward where Yokota sits on the floor, his atrophied legs folded beneath him, and his body animated by involuntary facial contortions and head and arm movements. All are symptoms of CP, which can impact a range of muscle groups, including those that control speech and mobility. Hara crouches to keep the camera at Yokota's level so that the legs of other seated passengers can be seen around him. When the conductor announces the stop, Yokota, lurching forward, suddenly falls out of the frame. Here, Hara runs out of film, but the microphone continues to record, and the train bell peels over this freeze frame of the door, which you see here, but Yokota is no longer in view. The tense asynchrony of the frozen bell, the frozen image and the ringing bell amplifies the misfit of living with disability. Disability scholar Rosemary Garland Thompson calls misfitting the process whereby minority embodiments are either excluded or maybe even mortally endangered by environments designed to fit normate bodies, in this case, vertical walking bodies. In 1972, train stations in Japan offered no automatic gates, ramps, or electric lifts for passengers in wheelchairs, all examples of what the ADA terms reasonable accommodations that make facilities accessible to people with disabilities. And I can say more about this later, but the equivalent anti-discrimination laws have yet to be passed in Japan. Hara's challenge to Yokota to board a train without his wheelchair or a personal assistant was inspired by a book popular with student activists of the time, Terayama Shuji's Throw Out Your Books and Head for the Streets. Hara has said that he wanted to both upend non-disabled people's unexamined perceptions and values regarding disability and agitate his Greengrasses collaborators who had already achieved national prominence for their activism into more risky and extreme actions. And here Yokotha's performance, his crawling performance, produces both public and private frictions. Because Hara runs out of film, we don't find out until the next scene when Yokotha's wife bitterly chastises Hara that Yokotha has disembarked without harm. In the second scene, Yokotha responds with his own philosophy of non-compliant friction. A recorded exchange between Hara and Yokotha plays over the scene in which Yokotha's assistant carries him from a car up a steep flight of stairs, across a busy train platform, and onto the train. Hara's speech is even and clear. Yokotha's is slurred and punctuated by gurgles, keening sounds, and elongated syllables. Yokotha, who is planning a public poetry reading, argues that it's more important that able-bodied audiences experience his performance than understand his poetry. And he says, I think they will understand something, even if they don't understand every single word. And then Hara asks him, are you okay with this? Should we set it up? Shall I make a sign explaining that it's a poetry reading? And Yokotha says, well, if they're really listening, they'll understand. And he reasons that the onus of making sense of his CP-inflected speech should not be on him. Not understanding, he argues, could make his audience listen more deeply. And Yokotha locates that deeper listening as untimely, a listening that continues reflecting upon itself even after the event of speech has ended. I hear these two scenes as a call and response, or an instigation and a counter-instigation that shapes Hara and Kobayashi's Crip cinematic idiom. Yokotha was influenced by the teachings of Reverend Osarangi Akira, a socialist Buddhist monk and philosopher who established a separatist commune for people with CP, where Yokotha and his wife had met and married. Yokotha's approach to listening also undeniably influences Hara's decision to craft a non-sync, anti-realist aesthetic that offers no easy fit or linguistic access for non-disabled audiences. The centrality of sound and listening to this Crip documentary aesthetic has much to do with the fact that the disability movement in Japan was led by people with severe speech impediments, many of whom, like Yokotha, had dropped out of school and were not involved in the student movements, which stoked their own activism. And Yokotha shared this outsider status and class identity with Hara, who had dropped out of photography school to support himself, and Kobayashi, who is a polio survivor whose leg disability and rural schooling excluded her from studio-based film apprenticeships. So that's her on the right, holding the microphone up to Hara's first wife, Takeda Miyuki, in a still from another of their films. Hara has described action documentary as a philosophy of mutual provocation and attack, evocative of Brechtian estrangement. An action instigated by the camera is filtered through the profilmic body, whose action in turn becomes a provocation for the filmmaker to examine what their encounter makes visible. Hara has named the civil rights and Black Power movements, as well as Japanese pioneers of intersubjective and collectivist documentary approaches, like Ogawa Shinsuke, Hani Susumu, and Tsuchimoto Noriaki as important influences, alongside the formal avant-gardism of Matsumoto Toshio. And it's important to note here that Hara and Sachiko were not familiar with the works of direct cinema and cinema verite, which were emerging in North America and Europe at roughly the same time as they did in Japan, but in response to different social forces. But what I want to say here is that Kobayashi, Yokotha, and Yokotsuka must be named among these political and aesthetic influences. The decisions to leave the ghettoized confines of residential facilities for people with disabilities, and in the case of Yokotha, the separatist commune established in Maharaba, and forcefully enter public spaces and conversations, indelibly shaped the confrontational aesthetic of disagreement, debate, and performativity that would become a hallmark of post-verite film and video in Hara's wake. Action documentary's emphasis on physical and sensory ways of knowing and being, or what Lucia Najib calls its corporeal realism, can therefore be understood as a Crip methodology that embraces disabled body minds as aesthetic resources. Hara's instigation turns Yokotha's body into an able vision camera that registers what non-disabled onlookers have stopped noticing or maybe never ever acknowledged about their built environment. The disabled body as camera metaphor is even more explicit in scenes featuring Yakutska. Challenged by Hara to photograph strangers up front and uncomfortably close, Hara called this the 1 meter exercise. Yakutska walks unsteadily towards pedestrians in crowded streets, camera raised to his eye by shaking hands. And here I will ask the audience to go and take a look at the first clip. Okay.
Right.
This exercise, usually read as a reclaiming of the non-disabled gaze upon the disabled body, is experienced by Yakutska as physical terror and exhilaration, sensations that Yokotha also reports. At its core then, action documentary examines how Crip discomfort and risk, sensations produced by wrestling access from ableist situations and spaces, test the core assumptions of documentary realism and demand a new value system. What might it mean for film audiences, especially non-disabled audiences accustomed to having easy and non-threatening access to disabled voices and bodies, to be cripped by such embodied risk and discomfort? Can documentary bring these entitled listeners to their knees to meet bodies crawling, slurring, and shaking in Crip time? These are the challenges that Hara and Kobayashi set for themselves and for their audience. If Yokotha and Yakutska can face an inhospitable world without the supports that minimize its frictions, they reason, then the audiences of their film can very well plunge into their film without the supports, the audiovisual and textual accommodations that transform disability experience into accessible sound bites. When Goodbye CP is shown in Japan, Hara insists that it be screened without subtitles. Instead, he circulates a pamphlet that contains a transcript in Japanese. The effect, writes Hara scholar Joel Neville Anderson, is that if a viewer is not accustomed to communicating with people with CP, they're likely to struggle to understand their speech and they have to refer to the transcript. And he continues, thus the experience of watching a Hara film, and especially this one, is a markedly different experience when viewed with foreign subtitles that offer immediate translation in a familiar and comprehensible format. I've come to understand these choices as access obstacles that acquaint non-disabled audiences with the unpredictable compressions and dilations of time and space involved in negotiating access. Think of it as a type of collective power sharing and a meaningful effort at inclusivity in which non-disabled audiences give back by building access and social capacity for people with disabilities. US disability law interprets access as the ability to move, enter, move within and operate a device, service, environment, or facility, and accommodation as a design or protocol modification that enables access. Subtitles offer linguistic access to non-native speakers of a language spoken in a film, but when they're used to translate disability-affected speech, they alleviate the temporary or situational disability of non-native listeners, even as they accentuate disability-affected speech as untimely and slow. Accommodations, J. Domarge notes, have a chronicity, a timing, and a time logic. They are retrofits. They come after the fact. Anyone who has requested, say, a wheelchair bus or course releases from the university can attest that accommodations are slow to come and fast to expire. They routinely involve painful inconveniences of space, like poorly located accessible entrances, too small elevators, and harmful delays. So, for example, bureaucratic systems may move slowly. They may refuse to move at all or refuse to acknowledge the problem. Accommodations may be time-consuming to use. Hearing and sighted audiences rarely encounter such obstacles in accessing disability-affected speech. Accommodations like proper synchronization and timely translation have been normalized as default access features. And in contrast, captions and audio description are often unavailable even when they are explicitly requested by people with disabilities. I've seen Goodbye CP projected without subtitles or transcript, and because to my knowledge, no English language transcript exists. And I have seen it in the subtitled digital version that I'm showing you today. For non-speakers of Japanese like myself, habituated to the sync-sound realism of Euro-American verite at that period, the latter retains the challenging opacity of the former. So even with subtitles, there's a certain opacity to the film. Goodbye CP is obstinately out of sync. Absent or erratic synchronized sound was actually not unusual for small crew and low-budget social documentaries made in Japan in the 1970s. So Hara shot this film on borrowed Arriflex and Filmo wind-up cameras. So, the shot length is really short. The edit is cheap and rough. But even so, the mismatch of image, sound, and subtitle in Goodbye CP stands apart because of the laborious engagement that it demands, especially during interviews with the Green Grasses members. I find that it engages me in an accented listening activity of which I've often been at the receiving end. I can best describe this listening as an auditory equivalent of staring, a highly focused, intense, and excessive listening, scanning, looking, reading, in which the listener, encountering speech that is foreign to their ear, leans in too close for comfort and asks the speaker to repeat what they've said, differently and comprehensively. Garland Thompson have described staring as an ableist mode of listening, an ableist mode of looking at visibly disabled bodies. An intense, sustained looking whose profligate interest is socially inappropriate. Staring, she insists, can be socially productive because it demands a response. Starees, so the person who's stared at, are often adept at taking charge of the encounter and engaging starers in ways that can be mutually transformative. My sense, though, is that Hara and Kobayashi are leery, as am I, of burdening the staree with transforming the relational dynamic under circumstances in which they have already been robbed of consent. Staring listening is entitled listening. It puts the onus on the stigmatized speaker to accommodate the normate listener. To listen in the provisional and delayed presence of linguistic access to speech that is untitled is to listen not as a starer, but as a crawler. It is to listen without the expectation or the certainty of access. It is to acknowledge the reciprocity, interdependence, and unevenness of access with the understanding that being disentitled can be a form of hospitality to the access needs of disabled people. I keep returning to one sequence of the film featuring close-up confessionals with the men with CP, speaking about their delayed, furtive, failed, and non-consensual first sexual experiences to grasp what is at stake in crawling listening. These men speak frankly about being coerced into abstinence and sexual predation because of their disability. It's a disturbing sample, just one of the scenes. And once again, I'm going to have to. Sitting with these out-of-sync testimonials of negotiating access across profound asymmetries of power, I find myself reflecting on their oblique pertinence to the experience of crawling listening. To listen as a crawler, to wait for a transcript that may or may not be available, to wait for a mouth to form itself around a sound, to wait for a textual translation that comes after a sound that precedes or comes after its corresponding image, is to learn to listen in Crip time. Disentitled listening is a listening out of time. Listening to someone with extremely slow language production can make one slip into an altered sense of time. It makes me attentive to how documentary time is clocked, measured, and trimmed, often at odds with the out-of-sync plotting of disabled life. It helps me to accept the lag between listening and understanding, to practice what Lisbeth Lepari calls an otherwise listening that is hospitable to the unfamiliar without immediately inserting it into some tidy box of understanding. As Irina Linebacher notes, documentary listening is acquisitive and inquisitive. It is a listening for. Such entitled, extractive listening resembles what the Indigenous studies scholar Dylan Robinson, describing the insatiable settler colonial appetite for palatable Indigenous sonic resources, calls hungry listening. Staring listening, too, is hungry for familiarity and certainty. It mines the content of documentary speech without care for the relational acts of hospitality, exchange, or theft involved in the negotiation of access. Crawling listening acknowledges that access is, like listening, is a more than two-way street, and that embracing access as a shared responsibility rather than a drain on resources may result in collective gains, even if these gains are not guaranteed, but contingent, temporary, and laborious. Part 3, listening sideways as access intimacy. What if listening in Crip time were the default rather than the anomaly in documentary? What would documentary practice and form look like if access were a primary consideration rather than a retrofit, and the basis of ethical, aesthetic, and narrative decisions? Questions like these form the foundation of Jordan Lord's practice. As Lord puts it, disability, like dependency, is a form of social wealth. It is a bond that grows. Shared resources invites a sideways listening less interested in familiarity or certainty than in how meaning grows thicker, slower, and stranger when it is mediated through another person's embodied particularity and access needs, as circuitous and time-consuming as this may be. Listening sideways is not about the point so much as getting to the point, or even just simply getting around. It cultivates an appetite for access intimacy, or what disability justice activist Mia Mingus calls that elusive, hard to describe feeling when someone else gets your access needs. This is a powerful act of solidarity. When access needs are treated not as inconvenient afterthoughts, but as formal building blocks, transformative shifts in documentary relationships follow. I've come to think of Lord's relational and formal commitments to baked-in access as a refusal of the austerity thinking that leads documentarians to think of participants in their films as liabilities that threaten their access to resources. Liability concerns lurk unstated when filmmakers admit backstage negotiations into the cinematic diegesis after the fact. In Goodbye CP, for instance, Hara keeps his camera running during a fight in which Yokotha's wife angrily objects to Yokotha's crawling performances, and to Hara and Kobayashi forcing their way into her home to capture their private discord. When asked to account for his decision, Hara claims that Yokotha's wife granted him permission to use the footage despite her disapproval, and Yokotha and Yokotsuka have both defended the film as a collaboration. Lord's insistence on access as a first principle prompts me to understand such post facto efforts at accountability as retrospective access accommodations, or retrofits. Documentarians compensate for the harm that they've caused by devising makeshift structures to redress complaint and to protect their investment. The trope of the reaction scene is one common retrofit. Another is the justification of directorial decisions by film participants in post-screening Q&As. Shared resources is an exercise in moving away from such adversarial and prosecutorial interpretations of access as risk management. The implications of this shift for documentary become apparent during an interview with Lord's father, Albert, about his work as a debt collector and his subsequent bankruptcy. Albert responds to Lord's queries as a spokesperson for the very person that left him with no social safety net when he was fired. Good lenders, Albert reasons, have a responsibility toward their borrowers, and good borrowers, he says, owe it to their creditors and to themselves to make good their debt. Albert also says that he doesn't regret the massive loans that he borrowed for Lord's college tuition, believing this to be his responsibility as Lord's parent, which he has now fulfilled. Reflecting on Albert's internalization of his neoliberal logic of risk management, Lord muses that even in documentary, it has become commonplace for filmmakers to secure access by outsourcing risk to their interview subjects. In fact, this is the very logic behind the release forms that filmmakers will ask subjects to sign to release them from liability. And here we're going to do another go around with the so play Crip, clip number 3, everyone on Zoom. Before and during the interview with Albert, Lord cuts back in scenes from his daily life that reveal the debilitating and ableist logic of his audit. These scenes reinsert the structural violence that Albert elides in the telling of his story. And here it's worth noting that the story form that's favored by commercially viable documentary reinforces the individualism at the heart of neoliberal capital in the story form, as of the property form, as Brett's story has argued, by emphasizing the individual over the social and the character over the condition. Albert is shown in these kind of cutback scenes, driving to the bank from which he was fired to deposit checks and to use the coin machine no less than 4 times. He visits an ophthalmologist who tells him that the only way to control his retinal damage is to get his diabetes under control. At home, Deborah cooks soup with canned vegetables, the only kind that the family can now afford. Lord's sister remarks that Albert's health issues could benefit from a freshly prepared diet. If Albert's account suggests that individuals are responsible for their recovery, whether corporeal or financial, then these reverse cutbacks, material that's dismissively referred to as B-roll, suggest that recovery is less a return to a prior pristine state than a series of painful detours and backslides through the wormhole of Crip time. They stick with the listener, demanding a different kind of accountability, another type of social glue or contract. Lord answers that demand by rethinking documentary access beyond the capitalist model of artificial scarcity and gatekeeping as a queer and Crip practice of sharing resources and building social capacities. Their insistence on burned-in access performs the speculative, improvisatory, incomplete, and yet thoroughly necessary work of caring and support that Mingus calls access intimacy. Mingus elaborates, it's the good kind of access, the moments when we feel pleasantly surprised and we feel seen. It's a way of doing access that transforms both our today and our tomorrow. Access shifts from being an individual responsibility to a collective one, from silencing to freeing, from isolating to connecting, hidden and invisible to visible, from burdensome to valuable, from a resentful obligation to an opportunity, from shameful to powerful, from ridged to creative. Access intimacy rewires the mandate of invisibility that has guided the industrial history of sensory access for audiovisual media. Following an all too brief broadcast experiment with open captions, captions and audio description have largely been segregated to an optional track. And this placates able-bodied investments in cinema as an experience spoiled by translation. To this day, industry norms for captioning and audio description preach the values of inconspicuousness, discretion, and seamless integration. Style guides consist largely of design and pacing recommendations for retrofitting captions and verbal description to the film or TV program in the available space-time between scene changes and dialogue to minimize asynchrony and to maximize narrative comprehension. Best practices advise audio describers and captioners to be neutral, accurate, objective, and to avoid interpretation, commentary, or graphic or technical vocabulary that calls attention to itself. Users of these services have lamented the mystification, misdirection, and shrinking of cinematic experience under the neutrality imperative. The blind disability scholar Georgina Cleage has noted, for instance, how the withholding of information about nudity can, in addition to infantilizing blind audiences, lead them to fill in narrative information that's made explicit to a sighted viewer. In a related vein, deaf artist Christine Sun Kim has made a video explaining how the translation of music as a single word or symbol depicting a musical note impoverishes deaf spectators. And she suggests synesthetic alternatives. So for instance, a tiled floor is captioned, the sound of shampoo scent floating among the fog. Lord states that their intention was to work with access as the material and form of their creative practice. They share this investment with a number of other artists who have used access features to experiment with Crip aesthetics of complaint, displacement, substitution, overlay, and ventriloquy. So these are some excerpts from Joseph Grishli's inventory of institutional apologies that he has received. And this is a deaf artist. The first reads, Joseph, our apologies, as it's a live event and we don't have closed caption capabilities. And this is an image from Carolyn Lazard's A Recipe for Disaster, which overlays textual and verbal commentary over a caption still of Julia Child's French Chef, which was the first TV program to feature open captions in what would be a very short-lived experiment, because basically people complained and the experiment ended. Shared resources contributes an aesthetic of redundancy to this lexicon of access intimacy. What appears on screen is told, what is spoken or sounded is shown. The look, sound, duration, and feel of the film are rejoinders to the verity dictum, show, don't tell. As a theory of narrative economy, show, don't tell champions inaccessibility. Verbal commentary is thought to be tainted by subjectivity, and narrative is regarded as a didactic and redundant double telling. The viewer, presumed to be seeing, hearing, and neurotypical, is independently responsible for finding their way into the narrative through elegantly disguised and sutured points of entry. If telling reveals and doubles these openings, Lord doubles down on its redundancy as the lowest and most obvious denominator of access. Audio description is often resented and avoided by filmmakers more than captioning because it's expensive, it requires advanced consideration, and it requires creative compromise in the form of a well-ventilated soundtrack. So if you have too much sound, music, and speech to begin with, it's very hard to then retrofit verbal description, and this results in a kind of acoustic congestion. Lord turns this constraint into an opportunity to explore how access features can guide not only the look and feel of a film, but also its narrative logic. The basic principle of audio description is say what you see. Where best practices and style guides see a covenant of fidelity to an original text premised on able-bodied assumptions, Lord finds a Crip philosophy of ekphrasis, a fount of narratorial invention, and a means of activating what is not shown. Audio description may sound objective and authorless, but as Cletus noted, it is often multiply authored. Lord's process honors its collaborative and subjective character. For every scene that appears in the film, Lord asks Deborah and occasionally Ashley to watch the footage with and without sound and record 3 different descriptions. 1, how they reacted to seeing the footage. 2, how they would describe it to someone who could not see. And 3, what was left out of frame but important to know. Lord then edits these 3 types of take into one voiceover track, supplementing the descriptions and commentary. Deborah's is the voice that we hear most frequently along with Lord's. Lord's commentary and descriptions, which you heard in the scene that I showed, neutrally intoned in the simple present tense, have the effect of zooming out to present analyses of abstract and invisible structures like the credit economy, like internalized ableism. But as a combined effect of her willingness, maybe also her need to open up, and her intimate and emotional delivery in the present continuous tense, Deborah's descriptions sound like an internal monologue that takes us inside the film to show how these abstract structures are felt and lived. As a sighted and hearing listener, I've experienced this collective description as narration as a kind of sideways growth of the film, in which the telling of what is shown offers the listener a backstage pass to a different dimension of the film. The backstage, as Parth MacArthur and Tina Zavitsanas have written, is the space of access work, that invisible and inaudible relay between people that literally and metaphorically props up Albert in the story of his recovery. So I would call, for example, what Christopher and I were doing before this talk began, a kind of backstage access work, a relay between people. Shared resources transpires in these waiting rooms of life, folding the tedium and repetition of access work into its narrative rhythms. In the foreground, the story of Albert's recovery marches along, unsteadily but surely. Meanwhile, Deborah, Lord, and Ashley wait at a bank parking lot as Albert deposits checks, place telephone calls to medical insurance agents, and they wait on Albert as he convalesces at home. Responding to their own images, they transport the listener to off-site and imaginary spaces of access work. To me, it is incredibly moving to hear Deborah's own perception of her access fatigue grow and evolve through the act of description. This is how she describes a different view of the occluded scene that opens the film, which recurs throughout the film like a fever dream. So one last clip, and for those on Zoom, you can even watch the fourth clip. Lord finds in Deborah and Ashley's double telling an aesthetic and narrative portal that grows the film sideways by cultivating a Crip kind of love for access intimacy. Sideways growth, writes Catherine Von Stockton, is a motion and a growth, even though from certain conventional angles, it might look like a way of going nowhere. If I were to describe my own auditory activity during Lloyd's film, I might say, I'm listening sideways. I'm listening to the workaround, to what must happen despite and because of all that ableism makes unthinkable and nonsensical. Sideways listening is the opposite of listening for the gist. It means listening for the props and supports that have been cut out or kicked away. It means falling in love with the thickness and slowdown that comes in Amal de Blon's words, from becoming involved with the means of getting around or communicating and the poetry and choreography of that means. It means developing an ear for the unaudited and unaccounted love work of collective care that props up documentary stories. Conclusion. Rethinking documentary access as community trust. Access has multiple meanings and legacies. The modern legalistic meaning of access, understood as permission or ability to enter, has superseded an older medieval definition in which access refers to a fever or altered state. Goodbye CP and shared resources both invoke this older register of access, understood in the Crip sense of an attack or breach on predatory documentary values. Inequities of access, they show, cannot be solved by retrofits that seamlessly integrate people with disabilities without hurting majoritarian bodies or substantially changing the social structure. What Mia Mingus calls the good kind of access that transforms our today and tomorrow is an act of creative destruction that entails rebuilding new forms, new relationships, new systems of trust and accountability in the social wreckage of the old. Whether by withholding sensory access or foregrounding it as a first principle, Hara, Kobayashi, and Lord require audiences to experience access not as a supplement, but as an occlusion that bends our listening toward an apprehension of disability as the ground state of life, and a social world braced by the values of interdependence and mutual care. In short, by Crip forms of trust. This is why it's important to build the political capacity and muscle memory for the type of listening that these films practice. A listening whose difficulty is in direct proportion to its collective gains. This, to me, is a paradigm shift at stake in listening in Crip time. Thank you.